I don't know about the rest of you, but sometimes I wish I could go back in time. And I love what I do now, but I really loved teaching. And I know my students had a good time too, and they learned a lot. But I'd love the chance to go back and apply what I know now. I've learned a lot more about teaching, but also about the importance of assessment and of monitoring student progress. And I'd love to be able to apply that in the years when I was teaching. And the thing is, a lot of what we know now about learner progress has actually been researched in the last 30 years. About 70% of what we know now is just over the last 30 years. So I really shouldn't feel too bad about that, because it was about almost 30 years ago that I was teaching. Still, one aspect of understanding learning progress is knowing how to measure it, right? And we can measure progress using assessments. That's what we do. The thing is to ask ourselves, what are the tools that we use for assessment? How good are they at giving us clarity and information about our students and precision and knowing what our students need, where they're at, and where they need to go? You know, we can describe the weather in great detail, and we can even describe the size of a picture using the number of pixels that are in that picture, but with what kind of accuracy and precision can we describe how well our students are doing and what they need to do next? Well, let's discuss first a little bit about assessment and what we all know as educators in our experience. Now, learners will master different skills at different times. As you know, you've been in situations where there's a student in the class who seems to be rather quiet and other students are more talkative, but you come to find out that student's not necessarily lower. That student is just building his or her listening skill first, right? And advancing in listening, and speaking is going to come a little later. So when it comes to assessing this, sometimes that kind of is thrown off a little bit because, you know, the listening skill is stronger, and assessment simply doesn't always give us a perfect insight into the learner performance. And we all know that, and we do everything we can to try and broaden our assessment approaches. But it's one of our big challenges as educators. Another challenge of this is trying to communicate it between each other, because we can talk about beginners and intermediate and advanced, but two teachers might have a different idea of what intermediate means. Our teacher on the left is saying, my first class is clearly low intermediate. And the other teacher who was there said, really, I thought they were pretty intermediate. So we have our own experiences and ideas about the definitions of these things. In the beginning, in the 80s and 90s, when I was teaching, and still today, we will classify books as beginner, intermediate, advanced, levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. We kind of have a sense, right, a gut feeling about what these different things mean. But what about, across different publishers? Is a book top-notch 3 the same as an Oxford level 3? What about within the same company, a top-notch and a cutting-edge 3? Are they the same thing? Are we able to really define what a level 3 means? Is it intermediate or high intermediate? We finally have a mechanism and a tool for speaking about this together that we didn't have before, which is the Common European Framework of Reference. Now, I don't know if any of you were able to attend Federico's session right before lunch. It was excellent. And if I had known about it, I probably would have given it to all of you as a prerequisite before you came to this little presentation, because it was a great foundation for what I'm going to be talking about, because the CEFR is our foundation. I'm going to explain it just a little bit, though most of you are probably familiar with it. It's a research-backed framework for describing learner performance. It was, as the word European implies, it was intended for Europe, but it's been embraced all around the world. And it looks at the 4 skills individually, which is fabulous: reading, listening, speaking, and writing. So that now when I say, well, my student that I was talking about earlier is a B1 in listening, but she's more of a A2 in speaking, we have the same language and we can understand each other as long as we know how to define the different bands within the CEFR. The bands you can see on the left are, some are a little bit wider than others in terms of where they divide, and I'll touch on that a bit later. The thing is, language learners have a challenge, and assessment will give us some insight on our learners, and it can also kind of frustrate them. And why is that? Because of the dreaded plateau. I was just speaking about this at lunch with my colleagues over here. I feel like my Spanish has reached a plateau, and I've come to kind of a pre-intermediate or low intermediate level, and it's hard to get higher. And it's, everything starts out fast in the beginning, but the more you learn, the longer it takes to progress. And this is not just in our imaginations. This is really a researched fact that the more we progress in our language learning, or this applies to other skills as well, we reach a point where you have to put in more hours in order to improve. And this can be frustrating for students. I want to take a minute to illustrate this, and you'll start to get the picture of where I'm going after I explained this next little session. I've brought back up the Common European Framework of Reference chart, and I'm going to talk about how long it takes. Fernando also touched on this a bit, how long it takes to move through a level, just so you can get some insight for what it's like for your students, and how it's different at the lower levels. So how long does it take a learner to go through A1? And I've put up one of my slow learners. Slow because this learner comes to class only 3 to 5 hours a week, and maybe does homework, maybe doesn't do homework. So it's going to take a while for this learner to move through. If you think about the A1 level, if you're familiar with the beginning level, how many hours do you think this learner has to put in order to go from the bottom of A1 and reach up into A2? Think about it. Close to 100. Yeah, at least 100. You think maybe over 100? Possibly. Research, and Fernando confirmed this in his little document, it's actually 480 hours at that low and slow pace. You have to keep in mind that's what we're talking about. Now, there are other learners who come 5 to 8 hours 3 times a week, right? And so they're in immersion classes, and you're probably very familiar with students like that. If the slow, the person who takes less hours of English every week takes 480 hours, how fast do you think our speedy learner can do it? Just going through A1. So it's going to be a fraction less, right? Any guesses, like 240 or maybe less? We've got 95 hours. So 480 hours is actually, let's see, 95 hours is about 6 weeks. 48 hours, 480 is more like 2 years to move through a level. And this can be kind of demotivating, right, when they're trying to increase their level. So now you have some perspective on that, and I see almost everyone's sitting right next to someone. Think about the next level, and I mentioned that there's a plateau and a problem when you get to the intermediate level where you have to put in more hours. Talk for 60 seconds with your neighbor about our slow learner and how long it might take him or her to move through B1, which is the intermediate. Take a second, take a guess, just with each other. 480 hours is 2 years. All right, you probably guessed that it's at least double, right? Does anyone have over that? Yeah? 500? Anyone higher? Any guesses? I know it's challenging. But if you're using the CEFR, you might be surprised to find out it's 1,100 hours. Do you know how long it takes for this learner to get through 1,100 hours of English at 3 to 5 hours a week? It's almost 4 years. So the point that I'm making is that imagine you're a freshman in high school and they say, welcome to English class, and you're a B1 your sophomore year. Welcome back, you're still a B1. And junior year, hello B1. Senior year, 4 years still at the same level. It's a good measure. I understand what B1 is, but if you're a student and you're trying to make progress, it can be a little demoralizing to think that I'm not making progress. And for our speedy one, 380 hours. So that's less than 2 years, but still it's quite a long time. So what do we need to overcome this? I'm just giving you now a little illustration of what I was just speaking about, which is on the far left we have going through A1 to A2 and on up. And as you can see, the cumulative number of hours that you need to study to get into the higher levels on the CEFR really, really increases along the way. So what helps is if we can divide this into smaller bits, right? The CEFR, is it useful? Of course it is. This is our foundation. And the CEFR is good for seeing the distance, to know the goal that I have off in the distance and where I want to reach. But imagine that you're taking a trip across the country and you're starting in Baltimore and you want to go to Sacramento. You hop in the car and you start moving along. Along about the time you get to Columbus, you're going to be, are we there yet? Because it helps if you can break it up. And you have a plan instead that's broken up into smaller pieces. This is more motivating for you because you know, okay, tonight we're going to be in such and such place and the next night here. And this helps when you can break things up. And remember when you take your cross-country tour that you should take a little detour to the Grand Canyon. That's what that dip is on the left. Don't miss that. Another thing about the CEFR is that it has an uneven distribution of can-do statements. It's really heavy in speaking, so it does tell us a lot about speaking, and which is great. But the other skills get less coverage right now. And also you'll notice in the middle that there's a bit of a spike, and that's because most of the descriptors within the CEFR are actually loaded into the pre-intermediate and the intermediate section. So if you're a beginning student, you have less information about what are the learning objectives that you should be focusing on in order to get up to that intermediate level. And same with the higher levels. And finally, one more thing about the CEFR that's challenging is trying to describe students between each other. So we have here a bunch of learners that are on the continuum, and we have here descriptors, the little white arrows, and then the bands for the CEFR that show how they're divided. And here are some learners 1, 2, and 3, if you can see them in the red numbers there. And if you look at learner 2 and 3, they're straddling the line between A2 and B1, but they're very close. However, the distance between learner 1 and learner 2 is wider. So if I say my A1 students, A2 students rather, are going into the same class, the gap between what they're able to do is actually wider, technically, and in reality, than that A2 student is to B1. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just that it's harder for us to communicate with each other about students and where they're at and to give that information to them. So what do we need? We need something that's more granular, that's broken down into smaller parts. And what we have is the Global Scale of English now, and also known as the GSE. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's mapped to the CEFR. They're completely compatible. In fact, John de Jong is the person who created the GSE. And he went back into the research, because believe me, this is a research-based, both of them are, program. And he went back into that research and managed to break things up into more granular bits. And this is the reason why. Because we have students, as I've said, who feel like they try and try, but they're not getting anywhere. And we want our students to believe that it's not impossible to climb this mountain, but it's actually something achievable. And that's what the GSE does help to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of detail about it. The Global Scale of English extends the CEFR to enable a more granular measurement of learner progress. Hundreds of additional research-validated learning objectives have been added to the GSE, excuse me, including over 50 descriptors below A1. So I was mentioning earlier that if you're at a lower level, you have less idea about what you need to do to move up, and there are now more. And the new learning objectives were vetted by a large pool of teachers to create a scale that is reflective of the needs of English language learners. Okay, I want to make a couple big points. First of all, the GSE is not here to replace the CEFR, not at all. It's built on the CEFR and it expands on it. And in fact, all of this research was done with the blessing of the European Council. And there are advisors from the European Council. Brian North was one who actually was one of the co-creators of the CEFR. And he was involved in the behind-the-scenes workings of creating the GSE. I'm not going to go into a whole lot about that, but it is all up on the website if you're interested in getting more information about the background and how it came to be. I also want to tell you a little bit more about the process of how the GSE was developed. But before I do that, I want to point out, you know the CEFR, the GSE numbers appear on the left side of that scale. So there's 10 at the bottom and 90 at the top, and a range in between, all aligned to the CEFR. And I want to ask you guys to think about why it's from 10 to 90 and not from 0 to 100. First of all, why don't we have 0 on the scale? Have any guesses?
Because everybody knows something.
Yeah. That's it exactly. And we don't want anyone, exactly, and we don't want anyone to think that there is an ideal 100%, 100 that you can reach. So this gives you a better picture of where you started and where you're going. Perfect, thank you. Now here's a little background into how the GSE was developed and is still developing. It's an ongoing thing and always will be. It's a live project. We created learning objectives. And learning objectives, as you know, define what a learner can do at specific levels of the global scale of English, just like in the CEFR. The sources used at the beginning of the study was massive. They searched syllabuses around the world, course materials that are very popular and used and understood among educators. National curricula was compared and pulled, and the CEFR itself, and all of these came together to create those additional hundreds of can-do statements. And what happened next was a group of 3 people, sat down and looked at each one of the objectives and rated their level of difficulty. And so in my example here, they gave a certain learning objective, a 44, a 43, and a 42. So once all that data was collected, the psychometricians went in and said, oh, that averages out to 43. Much, much more complicated, but that gives you the idea. And those entered the database. There were times, I'll have you know, that the data came back confused and it looked like a lot of people said it was high and other people said it was low. And what we did in those cases was we went back to the original writing of the learning objective and rewrote it and said, look, this is ambiguous, no wonder people didn't know what we were saying. And it was refined, and then it went back through the process again. Now, there weren't 3 people who did this work, there were thousands around the world. And these teachers are expert teachers who were either trained in workshops like this of how to understand the CEFR and to understand the GSE and how to rate them. And I'll give you an example just to know what that felt like to be a rater. And I was saying that they met in person, and some of them also did this online. And it went through the entire process to be validated. It might bring this home a little bit if I put you to work together in your groups for just a second. And I'm going to show you first, let's do this as a group. Here's one of the learning objectives that we have. You might be familiar, can identify details. Put on your thinking caps, guys. Okay, jump into this for a second. Can identify details that support a point of view in a panel discussion on a general topic. If you were rating that on, assuming that you are familiar with the CEFR at least a bit, and what some of the different qualities are, if you attended the earlier session, you might know that too. Is this a A2 plus, a B1? What kind of skill is this? Identifying details that support a point of view. Lower, intermediate, or high? What do you think? Be brave. Intermediate. Yep. About? B1 plus? We have here a score of 58. And if you look at between 50 and 60 on the scale at the top, I'm sorry if it's hard for you all to see in the back, but the GSC scale is on the very, very top line, and then the CEFR. And so a 58 falls into about a B1 plus range. Now, this is going to get easier from now, because now we're going to just talk about whether something is a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And this is going to it's all going to come together. You'll see why I'm doing this. So first we were doing a point of view in a panel discussion, and next, can take notes on a simple academic text. Is that harder or easier than identifying details that support a point of view? 55? 75, taking notes on a simple academic text. Anyone else, too? This guy is a 50, a little lower. I know you're thinking academic text, but you'll get a feel for a while comparing back and forth. Let's look at the next one. Can recognize the use of language that expresses doubt in a simple presentation or lecture. So the last one was 50, taking notes on a simple academic text, recognizing the use of language that expresses doubt. So they're not going to say, they'll say things like, I don't think, or I don't believe, or it might be much more complex. A little harder than taking notes, or a little easier? Okay. 55. So the process would be taking all of your numbers, putting them together, and coming out with an average. And if everyone in the room said easier, and everyone in that room said harder, we'd go back and refine that. Can suggest alternatives to hypothetical proposals in a general discussion. Which direction now? Higher or lower? 60. Yeah. Exactly. Quite more challenging. Take one chance to speak to your partner. Can discuss what to do in the evening or on the weekend. How low would that go? Higher or lower than the last one? Talk with your partner for a sec. What was the last one? Is at the top. Can suggest alternatives to hypothetical proposals in a general discussion. Lower than 73. Can discuss, so what are some examples? Can discuss what to do in the evening. I don't know, what do you want to do? I have ideas. Go for dinner, go to the movie. Oh, that's true. That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah. Discuss is a bit loaded in that one because it's actually lower. It's down to 40. So, boy, I see how challenging this is and why they had to ask thousands of teachers, and they probably had to really understand the different bands and what the definitions are. How interesting. The last one, can give a short rehearsed talk or presentation on a familiar topic. Compared to the last one of discussing, well, what do you want to do tonight? Takes a little bit more skill. Going up to 53, okay. So it's hard to do like on the spot, but that's sort of what the process was for teachers who were doing this, was comparing and going back and forth and rating how they fell onto the CEFR, whether they're in the higher range or the lower range. let's go back to the chart, and I'll bring this home a little bit. The motivational benefits. I was talking about the plateau earlier and how that can be demotivating when you don't see your progress. And our learners and how many hours they have to put in to move through the CEFR compared to having a more granular scale and the benefits of that in terms of motivation. We can demonstrate progress over a shorter period of time. Now, this does not mean that the global scale of English is a tool for helping students learn faster. That's not what we're talking about. This is simply breaking it up in a different way so that students can feel motivated. The smallest amount of points that can be measured on the scale is 3 points. So if you're looking back in A1, which remember is a faster, you can make faster progress, our slow learner, 120 hours to move through a small increment of A1. So, instead of 2 years trying to get out of A1, you now are in under a year of moving from one number up to 3 higher. In this case, of someone who's really immersed in the language, they're going to go in about 3 weeks, or 25 hours, 5, 10, 15, maybe 6 weeks, 4, 5, 6 weeks to move quickly. B1's going to be harder, but this is the most interesting number, 210. The same, it's true, when you're at the higher level, it's harder for you to move through and show progress. You reach a plateau, but I think it's encouraging that you spend 210 hours as opposed to 1,100 hours in order to see that number rise. And that's kind of the motivational angle of this, 70 hours for the faster learner. I want to explain, let me see how I'm doing here, what it means to be at level, because this is kind of interesting. It's a little bit math, for after lunch, but I want to explain that it has to do with probability. So your GSE descriptors are going to have a number of descriptors that are numbered at 51, and if you are a 51, does that mean that you are going to nail all of those that are at 51? That's not what it means. It doesn't mean that this is what you can do. It means that you have a 50% chance of being successful at anything that's numbered at 51. And this is going to be relevant for curriculum development, and I'll show you why. Because if a skill is above you, you're 51 and the skill is at 60, your teacher's going to need to scaffold that and give you support. And it's going to be very clear because I know my student's level and I know the number of the skill level, and I can adjust that and be ready for it. Or maybe I'm going to do a skill in class that is lower than 51, and I know that my students are around 50 or so I can add more challenging material to that. So that's how helpful it can be when you're building a curriculum using the scale. The scale includes listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and there are also descriptors written for the enabling features, which are grammar and vocabulary. And there are actually 4 booklets. I think of them as printed like booklets, but they're actually online. And the second one over is the basic one, and that's for adults. And the one on the left is for academic English. So it's all of the adult descriptors plus additional descriptors that are especially for students that are in an academic setting. The third booklet is for professional English or business English. Again, it starts with the adult learning objectives, and then it has many, many additional ones specifically for students who are studying business English, so it'll have special terminology. And the booklet on the right is for young learners. And that's actually in progress. I think it's almost final, but it's not officially launched as a final product, but about there. Key point, the GSE is accessible to everyone right now. This is not a product that's for sale. This is a tool that's freely accessible, just like the CEFR. And how can you use it? To improve teaching and learning. If you go online, there is not only all of the booklets, and you can scroll through and whatever level you want, and you can try and hunt, but there's also a toolkit. And this toolkit, you can put in whatever you want. Say you want to teach advice, and you know that your students are in the 50 range, and you want to do a listening activity. Well, with the teacher toolkit, which is an online tool accessible for you right now, anyone can use it, you can identify it, you could put in advice, and then you put in your level and which skill, and up will pop, it will populate learning objectives that fit that. And you can take those learning objectives without having to look through the entire booklet. It's there for you. And build your curriculum around that. It's very handy. I don't really have time to talk more about that creating content, but I'm here afterwards, and I also encourage you to, let's see, this is a little bit of the global scale of English. Sorry I had to skip this, but we are over time. Happy to show this to anyone later who'd like to know more about how you can use the GSE to develop your curriculum. Download it for free at www.english.com/GSE. Again, you can get all the information about the research and the process, who's behind it, download the actual booklets, and dive into the teacher's toolkit to be able to really interact with it. There's so much more to learn. That's how I started, and there is. And that's all. Thank you so much.
On behalf of ABLA 2016, we thank you very much for your participation, and we give you your diploma and your Mexican plate.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
First.